Emily, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for
Re-
having me.
Really nice to meet you. I've been reading some of your papers and following your work for a little while. So I just want to start by asking if you can just tell us a bit about your work and
Hmm.
yourself and what your focus is right now.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been a clinical psychologist. I guess I was licensed in 2013. I've had my doctorate, so that would be 11 years for posterity from now. I've had my doctorate for about 14. Since that time, I've also been a professor at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Here in the US, we have a master's program that is non-terminal. So we get people ready for doctoral training. It's really awesome because I get to sort of sensitize people to all of the joys that can be inside of science and help with that discernment of whether or not they want to do that before they're sort of in a doctoral program. But since that time, I've also continued to run a private practice. So I see clients. Traditionally or historically, I guess my practice sort of focused on issues around embodiment. So body image, sexual assault, sort of gender stuff. But over the years, it's kind of gotten to be more of a generalist practice. So in general, I guess work with folks that are looking to live their life a little bit more meaningfully, and a little bit more intentionally, I think. Folks that feel like life is sort of dragging them around a bit, tend to be a good fit. And I've also had the great opportunity ever since my doctoral training to do a lot of training. So a lot of clinical workshops, a lot of webinars, certainly since COVID, lots of trying to help clinicians by giving them sort of a framework that they can use to be as effective in the room in whatever way they want to be. And in particular, I'm interested in giving folks a framework that can help them to sort of attend to things in a moment-to-moment way, that can inform their interventions in sort of a right now kind of way.
Ah, cool. I love that. I love that. Um, I I was particularly interested in your work on like integrating interbehaviorism into clinical work. And I was reading some of your work, and you talked about the interbehaviorism as having been mischaracterized as a form of descriptive contextualism. I'm just wondering, can you talk about like what is descriptive contextualism? Why is interbehaviorism not that? And then we can just see where that
Yeah.
goes.
Sure, sure. So contextualism, of course, kind of comes out of a guy named Stephen Pepper's characterization of sort of what he called world hypotheses, or we might say world views, that are kind of observable in different sciences. So not necessarily that are articulated by those sciences, but that if you look at how they conduct themselves, you can kind of see, right? And what he was trying to account for is the idea that you can take two brilliant scientists with tons of data behind their perspectives, and they can sort of like talk right past each other, not be able to even have the same conversation. Their questions can like not even make sense to each other. And yet they're both, experts in their field. Both got all these loads of data. So what he said is if you differ in worldview, it's very difficult to communicate because you're very understanding of the nature of science, of what science does, of how to understand truth, that differs. And those were some of the things that he used to characterize these different worldviews. So contextualism was one of the worldviews that he sort of peeled out, that he said you can see in the sciences that he was observing. Of course, this is all from his perspective. And the two kind of main things about contextualism that he denoted, well, let's say three. One was the idea that the whole is primary. Sort of if you take anything that you're analyzing and you kind of chop it up into parts, some perspectives would say the parts are primary, and what you get out of that is sort of secondary, that the work is to sort of understand the parts first, right? That's the unit of analysis. Contextualism, though, was the opposite. He said, in contextualism, the whole is primary. Anything that we any parts that we peel out, that's just abstractions. We're sort of abstracting out different aspects of this thing that is a whole and that is really unable to be sort of separated in reality, I guess. Reality. I'm going to put that in quotes, reality. The other thing that he's noted is the root metaphor for contextualism. And he actually appealed to the metaphor of an act in context. So a behavior, some event that occurs, and said that you can't understand then any sort of bits that you're analyzing from a contextual perspective. You can't understand them without understanding the context in which they occur. So the metaphor of the act is the idea that an act, just like any event we might analyze, is a changing thing. It involves some change, right? We don't call it behavior or an action if there's not some change occurring. So an act, and then in context, meaning that we understand it in terms of the context in which it occurs. We can't fully understand what is happening unless we understand sort of everything happening around it. The third rather, dimension of contextualism that he identified is the truth criterion. And so what he said is that there's all of these different ways to understand or to answer the question, what is true? He identified correspondence, where particular statements that we make, labels, theories, whatever, that they sort of match the world. So they correspond to the world. They work like mirrors. Coherence would be that our facts sort of fit with other facts, other observations. Our labels fit with other labels, might be a way to say it. Our theories fit with other theories. But the third way, and the way that he said was really dominant in contextualism, was a truth criterion of successful working, or a pragmatic truth criterion, that we know that a label, a statement, a theory is true. So I'm going to put quotes on that too. We know that it's true if it works, if it helps us to do the work of whatever the analysis was supposed to do. And it may feel like I'm reaching sort of far back in the history of this, but this idea of these sort of parts or dimensions of contextualism are exactly how we might split out functional and descriptive contextualism. So one way of thinking about it is that root metaphor and that truth criterion are always in some tension. They're always going to be in some tension, because as I try to sort of pin things down to have a particular effect in a particular domain, maybe I'm going to have to let go of the idea of this sort of fluid relationship between an act and its context, or whatever the events are. It wouldn't have to be behavior from Pepper's perspective, but it certainly would be for me or for you, probably most of your listeners too. And on the other hand, if I hold really firmly to the idea of this sort of unfolding event with this unfolding context, this dynamic relationship being kind of the unit of analysis, and the whole being primary, then it might be really hard to pin it down into something that has action implications for right now, right? It might be difficult to sort of make it practical, right? In some of the arguments that I've heard historically, the idea was that if we hold too tight to that root metaphor, that all we can do is sit in appreciation of the whole. We can sit in the presence of the great unfolding, and that's kind of all you can do about it, right? That there's nothing really to do about that. That to get practical, we have to kind of loosen up a bit on that root metaphor. And that's the distinction that was made by Hayes and others a good while ago, was this idea that functional contextualism holds tight to that pragmatic truth criterion. At the end of the day, that's what wins, is we want an analysis that will help us to be effective, right? And the idea was that descriptive contextualism holds tighter to that root metaphor, maybe even at the risk of being fundamentally impractical. I was even told things like, what is the point of a scientific tradition if not to create more scientists and like count how many behaviorists right? As kind of a dig on like interbehaviorists, or how many interbehaviorists excuse me. And that was kind of a dig, that the idea was that descriptive contextualism was a category that was given or that was assigned to interbehaviorism by functional contextualists and by folks promoting functional contextualism. The dig being that interbehaviorism is not practical, that in sort of celebrating, the sort of dynamic nature of events and the interaction of events and the difficulty peeling apart any events without sort of losing something about the nature of the whole, that you end up not being able to do good science or even like good work, good intervention work, was the criticism. I've made the argument that, and I think echoed the argument of others that are more expert and have been longer in the field of interbehaviorism, have made the argument that, like, contextualism is a random philosophy that Stephen Pepper sort of, it's not even a full philosophical tradition. He sort of like espoused these worldviews as an interesting way of chopping science up into these different perspectives, and that functional contextualism, sort of gave birth to descriptive contextualism as a foil, as something to give people a place to land on, so as not to get sort of lost in the complexity of the whole, I guess. But I'll pause there. I've been talking a lot. How's all this, Landon?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I hadn't kind of got my head around descriptive contextualism, but I've read a lot of Linda Hayes and Freiling and Noel Smith and what Cantor I can get my hands on. And Cantor's description of science as a kind of system building activity where you need to start with philosophy that's based on direct observation and then build laws from that, and then you're kind of working up towards intervention in a way. Whereas it seemed like the tradition that Skinner created was about, you start with experimentation and you figure out kind of what works, and then maybe you figure out why it works later. And if you can't, I know that's an oversimplification of an amazing career, but it seemed like from what I've read, Cantor was more philosophically interested and grounded, and was looking at, like, if you read his work, he switches from, and that's why I think people get confused, because one minute he's talking about some theory in biology, and then he's talking about some theory in quantum physics, and he seemed to understand it all in ways that are baffling. But his description of science as a kind of a field of work where the philosophy sits at the bottom. I like what you said about Pepper kind of creating that, because there's like a little bit of Wittgenstein in there, of like language as use versus language as truth. But it doesn't kind of seem to all hang together that well. So that kind of makes sense. And I've heard that argument, that and reading into behaviorism initially, I was like, oh, that's great, but what do I do with it? So I loved your you talked about the unit of analysis a couple of times, and I loved in one of your papers, you talked about using the interbehavioral field as the primary unit of analysis. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really cool.
Yeah, sure. So, Cantor developed interbehaviorism first as a philosophical foundation, as you described. And then from there, sort of, you can almost imagine it as like a test subject, said, like, what if we took interbehaviorism and applied it then to psychology? What if we tried an interbehavioral psychology? Linda Hayes, who I think you've spoken with, has a really nice story about Cantor going to Skinner and saying, like, I think interbehaviorism is like the philosophical foundation, and radical behaviorism could be like the experimental tradition, and that Skinner rebuffed because he thought that behaviorism was its own philosophy and there was nothing else that was needed there. So I love that story. But so interbehavioral psychology purported this idea, this sort of construct for us to play with a bit of the interbehavioral field. And the idea with the interbehavioral field, which also can be described as the psychological event, they're mostly synonymous. The idea with the interbehavioral field is that I'll explain it in a couple of ways. I think the easiest way to sort of make sense of it is the idea that you never just have behavior, and you never just have context. That the two are sort of inextricably interacting all the time. They're participating in the same event. I describe it and I think Cantor describes it as a bidirectional relationship between context and behavior. And so you can imagine sort of these two, dynamic halves of the same coin. I hate to even say halves because it makes them sound like there's a natural divide, but we've got this constantly changing context and this constantly unfolding stream of behavior. I love that term, the stream of behavior, and that the two are interacting or participating in the same event in a bidirectional fashion. So if you think about it for a second, you never engage in any behavior that doesn't change your context. You wouldn't. Right? Like that behavior would not exist if it did not change your world, if it didn't impact your experience, what you can see, what you can taste, what you can think, what's happening in your belly, like what's happening in your brain. Everything that we do impacts us, impacts our context, right? And I say impacts pretty loosely because that sounds like a directional sort of causal piece. But what happens if we put right on top of it a relationship in the other direction as well? That everything that we would call context, the things that would make sense to call context, those things outside of the behavioral stream that co-vary with behavior, that those are impacting behavior constantly. Right? So it doesn't even really make sense to say impact if behavior is constantly impacting context and context is constantly impacting behavior, then really our fundamental unit of analysis isn't behavior. It's the behavior context interaction. And one way of sort of parsing that behavior context interaction, that functional relationship between context and behavior that's constantly unfolding, that's, dynamic and evolving relationship between context and behavior is in terms of the psychological event or the interbehavioral field. And anybody who knows interbehaviorism, even a little bit, who's listening to this is like, there's a lot more pieces than that, Emily, because of course, Cantor took sort of stimulus, right, and talks about stimulus and response functions as the functional relationship that we've been speaking about, but also talked about functional relationships between other aspects of context that participate in the field and other aspects of the kind of interbehavioral history that participate in the field. So we could talk about things like setting, or we could talk about, medium of contact, like how it is, where's that interface between the behavior and the context. We could talk about, different aspects of context. But for me, the simplest way to understand that interbehavioral field is to imagine this sort of unfolding, constantly changing stream of behavior with all of these different currents that vary in terms of how salient they are to the observer, how perceptible they are to both the observer and including the behaving organism themselves, and this constantly unfolding context. And that what we are, to attend to, what happens when organisms are learning is actually not just a change in behavior, because with every change in behavior, there's going to be change in context. That learning actually involves a change in functional relations. A change in the interbehavioral field, the functional relations that comprise that field. So if we are, talking about or thinking about therapy, we'd be talking about changing those functional relations between the client's behavioral stream, the behaviors, their repertoire, what they have available, to engage in different important places in their lives, and the different places that comprise their life. We could think about the same thing with teaching, with lecturing, with doing this podcast,
Yeah, so you've got this I don't know, it's like almost this ecosystem view of the field that we're working in. And like the field is a whole, and in a sense to analyze it or to understand it or to have prediction and influence, we're pulling out, like we're separating it into parts, but it's not really It's not really part.
Yeah.
And then one of the in inner psychology, like this key part of it is this relation between stimulus function and response function. But all of that is happening inside setting conditions. It's happening inside. There's a medium of contact you've got, and it's all this kind of, the history is present in the interaction. It's not like it's different. Like it's similar, but it's different to saying learning history creates change in the organism, and then we see this, compared to the history is kind of alive in the moment and influence. It's one of the factors that influences the field. It changes the shape of the field.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think if we were being really strict and, instead of saying like impact or influence, as we're saying, we'd say like it participates in the field. And that's one of my favorite sort of pieces of interbehaviorism and interbehavioral psychology in particular, that I feel like have a real, that really inform how it is that I want to do therapy. Because if I'm sitting with you and we're doing this intervention, you're my client, and I'm trying to like imagine some history that's not here. So I'm listening to you and I'm being with you, but I'm also like trying to construct this thing. I'm like trying to imagine while I'm with you, and sort of reaching for what could have been that would make this behavior happen right now, as opposed to considering the interaction that we are engaged in right there in that moment as a glimpse into that history. You are doing what is the natural sort of right now iteration of everything you have ever done in context like this, right? If I ask you to think about your dog, or your sibling, then right now in this moment, like as you begin to respond to that, it's going to iterate on every single interaction you've ever had with a context that evoked your dog or your sibling, right? It's going to iterate on that, and subsequent pets that you have with your dog or conversations that you have with your sibling will contain within them that history of you and I speaking about it.
So in the yeah, can you talk more about within your clinical work? Yeah, how do you work with that history in the moment? I know we're always doing it in a way, but how do you kind of,
Yeah.
how do you think about that and kind of apply it when you're sitting down with someone?
Sure. So if you think about sort of Cantor's approach to like verbal behavior, to relational responding, if we sort of stick with an interbehavioral perspective, we wouldn't really have a problem for RFT to solve. The problem that RFT wants to solve is, how is it that words can have all of these functions? How is it that, I could say a thing to you and, or you could think a thing, or you could interact with stimuli that you had only ever interacted with in terms of the words around them. And you could fear them or be excited or work really hard for them, right? They could have all of these functions despite you never having what RFT folks might call like a direct learning history with them. For Cantorian folks, for interbehaviorists, that's not really a problem. There's not a problem in there to solve. The idea is that there's two ways that things get their functions. They only get their functions from, basically by having sort of physical similarity, some kind of similarity to other stimuli that already have functions, or by being in close spatiotemporal proximity with other stimuli, and they acquire their functions that way. So that's it, right? And the deal with words is that words are super sticky kinds of stimuli. They're stimuli that we can emit really easily while we're doing other stuff, while we're in any situation, right? I could say dog, I could say my dog's name, which happens to be Ollie, which is a little odd that I thought of that, but right, that might actually change the functions of that word now that I've met you. But I can that the idea is that in any situation, I can both produce that stimulus and experience that stimulus. I could be cleaning a window and listening to a podcast, and next time I'm cleaning that window, I'm thinking about Kamala Harris, right? Because those two events happened at the same time. So words are super sticky, maybe in part just because of their form, like just because of all the ways that we have learned to emit them and receive them or perceive them, right? In written language, we can produce written language, we can make words. It's quite different. Like I can learn to respond effectively to a stop sign, but I can't be like, poof, stop sign, right? I can't just like produce a stop sign, right? I know sign language, so I could say the word stop with my hands, but it wouldn't be the same, right? So words for interbehaviorists are just super sticky. And one of the things that is so convenient then about that stimulus substitution that can happen so easily with words is that we can, as therapists, make any aspect of our client's life present simply by saying the words that are associated with it. Sometimes it's really obvious, like, hey, let's think about what happened at work last week. Sometimes it's not so obvious. Sometimes we don't know the functions of the words that we would say. And in fact, I would say most of the time, we don't know the function of the words that we would say. The only way that we would know, we only know the function of the words that we would say to the extent that we share a learning history with that person that we're communicating with. So to the extent that my words are making sense to you, we can assume some shared learning history. We've read some of the same texts, we've listened to some of the same talks, right? Maybe we've made some of the same observations. And the places where our words function differently then are of course the parts of our history that diverge. So we have this great opportunity in therapy that I think is often overlooked, actually, because of the way that language works. We can make any aspect of our clients' lives directly present right here in the moment, and then watch them respond. They will show us their interbehavioral history, at least this iteration of that interbehavioral history, and every interaction they've ever had with that aspect of their life will be present right here in the moment. We can directly assess how that aspect of their life is functioning, and we can directly intervene on it. We can evolve that relationship between their behavioral stream and that aspect of context. So if I, invite you to think about the hard thing that happened at work last week, and then I invite you to take a breath, and then I ask you what it's like to sit here with me, and you feel cared for, and maybe I ask you if you have any compassion for yourself going through that hard moment, and maybe you take a breath and notice connection and offer yourself compassion. And with each new thing that you do there, we're broadening out that behavioral stream just a bit. Suddenly, that aspect of context, things, like your work last Tuesday or the hard things that tend to happen there, like whatever, we don't even have to know exactly what the context, the object is, the physical context is that we're evoking. But next time you're there or around contexts that pull for that same thing, it's also going to pull a little bit for taking a breath. It's going to pull a little bit for looking for connection, and it's going to pull a little bit for self-compassion, simply because we've continued to evolve that functional relationship through the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense that what I hear, and tell me if I'm catching this, is like when you're sitting with people, you're kind of exploring the fields that are of interest to them, and the fields that, in a sense, the context, the fields that have brought them into your office or into your space. And then when you describe like taking a breath, maybe asking if they have any compassion for themselves in that moment, things like that, you're adding some different stimuli into that field in a way. Assuming that the field of last Tuesday at work exists as a substitute stimulus, as a memory for me, that that has all and that if we think of that as a field, there's substitute stimuli there, there's affective behaviors, so there's feelings, emotions connected with that are in relation with that. there's an identity piece that I think, say, new RFT is kind of interested in, like, what does that say? Who am I as a person if I have these kinds of experiences at work?
Right.
And then, of course, there's a whole range of setting conditions and things that I probably didn't even notice or may not even be able to recall. But what you're kind of doing is taking that field as it exists in the present, considerately adding some elements into it, and then seeing how you're almost saying to me, how does that field feel now that you've taken a breath? Or am I
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah.
catching that right? Yeah.
No, exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. You might imagine that, like, I imagine that that my clients and I are like moving around some space, right? Like maybe there's a big house that represents, like, different kinds of contexts that they move about in their world. And some of them they don't visit often, they're dark and they're musty and they're like filled with rats. And some of them they have no idea the door's locked, they haven't been in there in ages. Some of them they're in quite frequently and they've got a good job there. Some of them are nice and soothing, like all of these different contexts that have these different functions. And we're sort of moving around it, but somehow I can't see it directly. Like, I don't know what this room is, right? Maybe it's all green screen to me, or maybe you've got me like on a GoPro or something. And the only way I can know where we are is by watching you respond. So if I see you sort of hesitate, right? Maybe, and I watch your repertoire sort of squeeze down a bit. Maybe it looks like there's something scary here. And maybe I check and see what all you can do here so I can get a sense of just how scary it is. If you have trouble looking at me, or you have trouble giving yourself some breath, or you can't even quite put words around what's going on for you, then maybe I have a sense that it's pretty scary. That's stuff that usually comes quite easy to you. Um, so yeah, I imagine it like we are moving into these spaces. We're constantly assessing how these different contexts are functioning for the client, and then prompting when we find what I think of as kind of a good place to work, like somewhere where we have enough flexibility that we can work there. But it's the way that I say it actually might require a little bit of background. So we've got Cantor's sort of traditional psychological event, and me and some of the folks in my lab have suggested that we can think of that psychological event or that interbehavioral field as having another dimension, and that dimension being how aversive or repetitive it is, and the functional relation between all of the participating factors. And so if you imagine on one end, sort of if it's aversive, if the functional relations are aversive, that all of those participating events are narrowed. The medium of contact, like your ability to attend, is narrowed. You're focusing on, just the scary stuff. The behaviors that you have access to are narrowed and rigidified. The number of things that can be context, that can be setting events, the aspects of your history that are relevant are narrow and rigid, right? If you're having a stressful conversation, a scary conversation with somebody, maybe you get pulled over by a cop in the US, right? And what would show up is sort of this very narrow history, maybe related to incidents like that, being in trouble. Maybe your awareness would get quite narrow. Maybe you forget how to talk or how to regulate your emotions, right? Everything would get sort of tight and rigid. And you can imagine on the other end, the functional relations, what we might characterize as appetitive. So this is where we get breath and flexibility, the kinds of events that can participate in the interbehavioral field in any one moment, or the kinds of things that can be context. There's breath and flexibility there, and the kinds of behaviors or response functions that we have access to are broad and flexible. And I introduced this not just to sort of pitch my, like, I've revised interbehavioral psychology, but because I find it super useful in the therapy room. Like, it's exactly the process that you're talking about, by introducing new aspects of context and inviting then new functions to participate in the interbehavioral field. What are we doing? We're broadening out the interbehavioral field. right? We're broadening out the behavioral stream and the context that co-vary with that interbehavioral field. And this is how I understand psychological inflexibility and psychological flexibility, two of the principles by which we understand sort of, the struggle, the psychological struggle, and the psychological wellness and acceptance and commitment therapy.
So in a sense, you like people are coming into the space and saying, within this field, say, let's say it's my within my relationship with my partner, when these things happen, and they're not saying this, but I get really narrow, I get really angry, I get into fights really quickly,
Yeah.
because of these things that this is my history with conflict as a child, or this is what's coming up for me. And so in a sense, as a extra level of abstraction to help us figure out what we do with that field, you're kind of classifying that in a way as, okay, that field seems like it's aversive in a way. So there's a narrowing of what you can orient to. Or your attention's kind of pulled towards certain elements, and the history of the relation of stimulus and response functions is really, I don't know, inflexible, or it's really tight.
Yeah, exactly. And I would know this because I would poke. I mean, if I had just met somebody, right, they would come in and they probably wouldn't report their history. They'd say, my wife is like this, I can't stand it, I don't know if I want to stay with her. And I would start to try to introduce new behaviors. So I might say, like, can you tell me some of the feelings that are going on, man? And if they keep going back to, this, well, of course I'm mad, blah, 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 blah. But instead of really being with anger, they're explaining why they're mad, right? That might be a way that I could start to sort of see that this is inflexible. But I would guess that the arrangement, that the array that's participating within the interbehavioral field is aversive because it's difficult to introduce new aspects of context. That sort of very tight context behavior interaction, the field is so tight and narrow, and it's difficult to introduce new aspects to participate in it. And I know that things are more appetitive when you can sort of easily move behavior around in a particular space. And if you imagine, if, for those of you who do sort of know the psychological event, so there's an element called K, or, named or denoted by a K, and the K represents the unique arrangement of the participating factors sort of in any one moment. Sort of, you take a slice of that field, as a sort of constantly changing stuff, and you take a slice and you go boom, and you like sort of lay it out. You say, how are they interacting right now? That would be K in a particular segment. And so K, then we would say appetitive and aversive might be described as characteristics of K, of how broad that particular segment is. And so it's sort of constantly changing, right? And the reason that I started talking about this is that idea of finding a place to work. Sort of when I'm working with clients, I'm looking for a space that is appetitive enough that the learning is flexible, and the client feels that the interaction is chosen. Like I want them to be having that experience of freedom, what Skinner called freedom from aversive control. I want them to be sort of participating in the interaction in a flexible way. I want to be able to easily introduce some new elements and invite some new responses. But I want it to be aversive enough that it's actually going to matter, right? If I just create a cozy space that the client can come join me every week and be really super flexible, but I'm not bringing in any of the hard stuff. I'm not introducing any of the difficulties, any of the contexts that sort of squeeze them down. If I'm not introducing any of those, then anything they do in therapy will not be available to them elsewhere. Right? It will only be able to be available to them in contexts that are functionally similar to the context that I'm creating in the therapy room. So it's important that I'm bringing to bear some of those elements that typically participate in the aversive field, right? In the more aversive iterations of that interbehavioral field. so that the things that we practice here will be more available to the client in the parts of their world, in the moments, you know, that they're not sitting in the therapy room, sort of out in their actual life.
So would you say you're creating what like we could just call safety and
Mm.
and then trying to make that safety as useful as possible so that when from with usefulness defined as it's most helpful for the client when they step into those difficult
Yeah.
places in their everyday life.
Yeah, I might even go for more than safety. I mean, if somebody's in a pretty dire situation, like if their repertoire is pretty dominated by aversives, then safety might be where we start. You know, I think of appetitives as and behaviors that occur in appetitive context, the interbehaviors that occur there as being characterized by sort of seeking and exploring and engaging, a sort of curiosity and a creativity. So that's what I'm aiming for. Like I said, eventually, you know, people on the first time they meet me, most of them are not prepared to be curious about the worst parts of their life. But we're working towards that. Now the place that I really think about safety is if you imagine those sort of interpersonal aspects of context, right? Like me attending to the client with care, you know, me showing with my facial expressions that I am listening, me being encouraging or, you know, offering them, you know, just that kind of affection and loving, the kind of loving that is part of the therapeutic relationship. The way that I see it, the implications of this perspective would be that's not contingent, that those kind of relational appetitives, that context, that aspect of context, that's non-contingent reinforcement, to step into the Skinnerian world, that's free, you know, that's no matter what. It's not systemically applied when you're behaving in the way that I think is well regulated, and you know, withdrawn systematically when I think that you're not being regulated or right or wrong. Instead, because we have access to somebody's whole context, we can use things from their life to support and broaden out, to add appetitives. It doesn't have to be us saying, "Good job, I liked how you took a breath." Like breath will like have appetitive functions for some folks regardless. And if it doesn't, then my good job is not what I want to be doing. Right after something actually didn't work for somebody, I'm going to be going like, "Oh, it looks like that really sucked for you. I'm so sorry." You know, I wonder if we could try like really feeling your feet on the ground for a second. I'm looking to guide the client to engage in behaviors that are going to be resourcing to them, even if I'm not around. The safety comes with that therapeutic relationship being the foundational appetitives, if you want to think about it that way, that aren't going anywhere, that are not contingent on their behavior, not contingent on them doing their homework or showing up on time or paying their bill, but just part of what it's like to be in relationship with us as a therapist.
Yeah, so that there's a kind of baseline of that, and then the appetitives are more like to bring them into this curious, exploratory experience of looking at their life differently and looking at themselves differently.
Yeah, and we do it all. I mean, the implications I think that come out of behaviorism are so they empower us to engage experientially. We don't have to do what I call the plan and hope model, which is like a little bit of psycho-ed. We reconceptualize your problem, then we make a plan of how we're going to do it differently. Then we just like you leave, and we just hope that when you log off or walk out, that you're going to like do something like that, right? I mean, a lot for a chunk of my career, I felt like that's what I was sort of like stuck with, was kind of a plan and hope model. And I could maybe really get them really bought in and really saying they were going to do something different. I think what interbehaviorism empowers us to do, and interbehavioral psychology empowers us to do, is to do that work right here in the moment. If I see that you are having trouble in doing the thing right here and right now, why do I think that you're going to be able to do it out there? So let's try it on right now, right? If you say, the client says, you know, I think I really just need to talk to my roommate about what's going on. I mean, I might think that's a fantastic idea, or I might think it's a terrible idea, right? That's all going to be based on my history, some of it not with the client, some of it independent of the client. And in that moment, my job, if I'm kind of on the ball, will be to say, can you imagine doing that? What happens when you just kind of try that on? Are you able to like really imagine it? What happens in your body? Is there a feeling that fits what comes up here? And maybe even to also poke in the other direction. What happens if you just decided you are not talking to him about it? Like, no way, no how, you'll figure it out, that's it. What happens then? What does your mind do there? Do any memories show up? For us to sort of actually try that on together and see what happens.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Um, yeah, so in a sense, we're just kind of like exploring, and we're using language and the things that we can do with, that language lets us do, to our advantage, instead of it kind of just beating us up or pushing us around, as it kind of tends to
Yeah,
do.
absolutely. And I think if we sort of if we really take advantage of this, then what folks leave with is just more of a sense of freedom so that they can learn. I'm not going to teach them everything that needs to be done. I don't know if their roommate's going to be receptive or not. I only know what their history, is showing me right there in the moment. I've got no idea. But I want them to have flexibility when they move out into their world. I want them to be able to detect the appetitives that are available, to orient towards those, to discriminate the behaviors that might be necessary to be effective towards those appetitives. To tact it and track, like, how is my behavior working in this moment? Oh, there seems to not work so well here. Not like in other relationships I've had. I think what when we are doing our best, we are teaching clients to learn appetitively out in their world. We're teaching them to be able to go out there and learn what's going to be most effective in the unique array of contexts that make up their life. The unique fields, sort of extended in time, that is, functionally is their life. We couldn't possibly know. And so often, I think we put pressure on ourselves to know, like, what is the thing that they need to do? Even if that pressure is coming from us, that we feel very confident that we know what it is that they should do, we simply have no idea. So this is I think, a stance that requires, or maybe allows, some humility on the part of the therapist. We can't possibly know. We can only know the little bit that we can see here. And the best that we can do is empower people to go out into their world and to learn there. And to be with them when things work out terribly, as they may do sometimes. Because it's a vulnerable way, I guess, to move around the world. Flexible.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask you about mid-level terms a little bit, and I've heard you talk about that before. And when you talked about humility, I noticed, so I went from thinking a lot in mid-level terms in my clinical work, to largely discarding them in my work, and thinking of getting a little bit more concrete, and a little bit more, or getting a little bit more interbehavioral in the way I'm kind of looking at things. And I noticed, when I was thinking in terms of mid-level terms, I started to almost, like, in my thinking, prescribe to the client, like, okay, they're fused, so therefore they need diffusion, so I'll do a diffusion exercise. And there was this kind of, it felt it felt good, or it felt like purposeful for me. Okay, I know what to do. I see this. It's there's experiential avoidance, so we'll go towards that. But it also felt, yeah, it felt like a little bit like I was imposing that on clients, and there wasn't as much humility in it as I like to practice with.
Mhm.
Um, So I'm not sure what my question is, but I'd love you to talk a bit about mid-level terms and humility. And I guess
Yeah.
what I thought was there's this maybe danger in becoming a little bit mechanistic or a little bit like, okay, like I'm a doctor and I'm prescribing you some mindfulness because you're not in the present moment enough or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, like, take two leaves on the stream and call me in the morning. Yeah, so, it's my history with the middle level terms, and I'm specifically thinking about those in the hexagon model of psychological flexibility. I was really resistant at first, actually. Like from the beginning, I was like, how can you possibly peel these apart? I was like sort of an original act person before the hexaflex was a thing. And how could you possibly peel apart, sort of cognitive fusion from experiential avoidance? And how could you peel that apart from not being present? I just really resisted it. And my lovely mentor, as I don't know, reward or punishment, we'll see how it worked functionally, basically assigned me to get really familiar with it. Like it was brand new. And he's like, you hate it, so you're assigned to use it. I want you to use it in all your notes, all your observations. I want you to like get expert at unpacking, basically the session, acceptance and commitment therapy, from this kind of 6 component model, and report back when know enough to have an opinion. I had probably done like a month of therapy at this time that I had this strong opinion. And so I got really familiar with it, and that work and the subsequent sort of mentorship with Kelly, Dr. Wilson. Kelly Wilson was my mentor at University of Mississippi, and it actually ended up being a huge part of what we published in Mindfulness for Two. In that text was this kind of mid-level term based understanding of the process of therapy. And so my understanding of middle level terms was always as processes, right? As, we observe in the moment sort of, what is happening with the client, and conceptualize that in terms of inflexibility, these different components. And that's conceptualize how they might get better, or happier or whatever, come to thriving by sort of doing the opposite, building these skills in these component areas. The problem that started happening was, I would be sort of after a session, I'd be thinking about like, okay, acceptance. Well, like they told me that they accepted. Did I see them actually accept? They didn't look very accepting. Okay, well, let me kind of tease those apart. So then I started like drawing a little line, like, did I observe it or did they report it? And I like kind of took notes that way. And what I found myself doing was exactly what you're describing. I found myself having a hard time focusing on process beyond they look fused. Apply one diffusion exercise. The client looks avoidant, apply one avoidant. And what happened is stuff like, I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, is like people are doing like rigid self stuff. And I'm like, I keep trying to solve this context, and you're like not getting it. And what ended up happening was a sort of rejection of, I think, some of our most awesome foundations in contextualism and behaviorism and interbehaviorism. Skinner said the rat is always right. And I think that what he meant is that the rat's behavior is never an issue with the rat. It is an issue with the context that we have created. And, not to call our clients rats, but, we could also say the client is always right. Like what the client is doing in therapy is the exact right thing considering the context you're creating. They could not do anything else, literally. You have created a particular context, and they are doing the only thing that you have created the context for them to do, or all of the things we could say that you have created the context for them to do. And so anything that gets me going, like you did the inflexible behavior, and then I did the flexibility intervention, and you're now not more flexible. And so now I don't know what to do. That's not sensitive enough for me. It's just not sensitive enough of a tool. I found myself starting to go, well, I mean, I could ask somebody to, be more present. I could do a present moment intervention because I don't think they're ready for self as context stuff, or or I could just ask them, if there's anything here that they want and just see if there's any like value stuff in the room. And then it became such that, well, if we could literally do any of these 6 things anytime in any moment of therapy, and that potentially move us towards flexibility, what is this? Why am I spending so much time trying to go, was that, avoidance or diffusion? Like, I don't know where to put that, Um, so instead I did this kind of crazy thing. I pulled a bunch of tape that I had. New Harbinger had put out a bunch of different tapes of like act masters. I pulled some tape of my own, and I started sort of whittling away at this way of understanding the process in therapy. And the way that I did it, as I said, I mean, presumably we're not crazy, we're up to something. Like we're not sort of actively like floridly psychotic and thinking that these behaviors might be important for people to be able to move towards things that are difficult or to observe their own thinking. And so I sort of said, well, if we look at all of these practices, all of these interventions, if we look at some of the people that have such mastery, what are they actually asking clients to do? Right? So if we take out like the whole leaves on a stream, sort of exercise or whatever, what are we actually asking clients to do? We're saying like, hey, observe your thoughts. Like that's what we're doing. And like, couldn't we just do that? Couldn't we say, are you remembering something right now, Ollie? Or I'm wondering what you're imagining. Can you pause and notice what you're imagining? And when we're sort of doing all these big acceptance interventions, like, couldn't we just say, could you sit with that for a second? Or I'm wondering if you could lean in. Like, could we ask him to approach the hard thing? Or if being present means paying attention to our ongoing process, could we say, like, can you tell me what's happening in your body right now? Or, what are 5 things you see? um, if self as context is being able to orient towards the self in lots of different ways, such as this sort of sense of self that's independent of all of those specific self functions. If that's a thing, then like, why am I talking about chessboards? Maybe I could just ask, is there a response that you have to that that you're remembering? Do you have any feelings toward him? You know, um, I'm wondering if you have labels. Like, do labels come up as you describe yourself at that moment? Do you have any hopes for that person? Do you feel protective of them? Do you want to kick them? How is the self functioning? Let's start to observe that and see if we can vary and stretch that out. So really sort of ended up peeling out all of these specific things that can be target behaviors in the room that tend to drop out when people are in aversive contexts, when that functional relation between context and behavior is aversive, and that tend to support a sort of expansion of the interbehavioral field or the functional relations that are at hand, simply by engaging in that behavior that kind of end up having that possibility. So that's how I think about it now. I think about it in interbehavioral terms and in that sort of that at any moment we're watching things sort of squeeze down a little bit, get big, get big and flexible, get narrow and rigid, get big and flexible, get narrow and rigid. And that the options that I have are to invite the client to do a thing or to introduce some new aspect of context are not inconsistent, in most ways, not inconsistent with those sort of 6 components of psychological flexibility, but actually sort of give me a thing to be curious about in this moment. I wonder if they could, tell me what's happening in their body right now. I wonder if they could give me an emotion word that fits. I wonder if there's another perspective that's accessible to them. Like, I can wonder with them about what they're able to do there. And we have that, by doing that, we have that sort of iterative assessment and intervention, right? Where I'm learning like how aversive or appetitive this context is, while also intervening and seeing what all they can do here, by seeing how far we can stretch the repertoire in with this particular aversive thing present.
I kind of get the image as you're talking of like 2 people like walking around in a forest, and I often think about those fields that clients are describing as spaces, like you said, and I like the idea of a forest, because when I think of a stream, I think of it as like, yeah, you can look at a particular bit, but it's also this kind of moving thing. Whereas I like that the kind of forest metaphor, because it's like this space that's evolving over time. And as you said, there's all these
Mhm.
different corners and different things. Um, and I just picture like two people, walking around, and like when I walk around here, I'm like, okay, the yellow-tailed black cockatoos are like interacting with this particular tree, or the wattle's responding to the longer
Mhm.
days, even though it doesn't feel warm, like it feels colder to me. We're in winter. But there's like these blooms coming out that are like, they know the day's
Mhm.
longer because we're past the solstice, or there's all these little things happening in these spaces. And when I think like some of the new RFT stuff, it's like when people think of, say, my relationship with my partner, they have
Mhm.
a kind of uh, a coherent story of what that relationship is, in a way.
Mhm.
Like that relationship is good or it's bad or it's difficult or it's easy or whatever. And there's all this kind of nuance in there that's missing. And when we walk around in
Mhm.
that forest, it's like there's like a trillion different stimuli interacting, and some of them stand out more than others. But as you describe that, it's like, okay, like some of these thoughts are like, I think Linda Hayes described it as like serially stimulating. So a thought
Mhm.
stimulates another thought, which stimulates another thought. And we talk about train of
Mhm.
thought. And then there's these emotions attached to it. And then there's a body reaction to that. And then there's like these whole organism responses to
Mhm.
things. And I hear you kind of saying to the client, like, well, essentially when this stimuli, that's the thought of you as a child, comes up, what other thoughts are coming up with that are some of those labels. How does it feel in your body when those labels come up? How do
Mhm.
you,
Mhm.
like you said before, if you take a breath and just sit with that heaviness in your chest, what happens? So there's this real kind of dynamic, but it
Mhm.
and I think Mitch Freiling described it as like the field is the cause of everything, and all science is
Mhm.
just mapping relations in fields. And I hear you
Mhm.
as you describe it, like helping the client kind of, and with them mapping those relations and understanding how things interact.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. And I think changing the relations, if you imagine that coherent story is like a trail that they've walked a million times, right? So we're like taking off and they're going and see, there's the cockatoo and there's that same old, gourd patch and here's the tree. I've seen that a million times and here's this. Then my job is to sort of pause and say, could you touch the tree? Like, tell me what it feels like under your fingers. Like, maybe close your eyes and like put it right on there. Or tell me how many colors you can see in the cockatoo. Like, I can't see it. Like, maybe again, I'm on a GoPro or something. Like, we're on FaceTime. Tell me what happens if you appear a little closer there. What impact does that have? And could you take one foot off of the trail for just a moment and see what happens? Like, is the ground hard there? Is it spongy? Right, there's this real sort of sense of doing that. And if we do that enough, like what happens is that everything starts to look like a trail until nothing looks like a trail. There's leaves that start to gather over that trail that you've walked a million times until one day, like you have that, something that sort of brings that up and you respond to your partner in this old way and you're like, shit, I didn't know that was still in there, you know? Because meanwhile, you're like off traipsing through other parts. You're maybe some days you're like climbing up the tree and sitting up there and letting the wind blow. I mean, the nice thing about the stream metaphor is that it really points to the complexity of our job in observing behavior because we are creating a constantly changing context and the behavior coming at us is constantly changing and it's got all of these currents within it, all of these different things going on. So if it's a forest, I want it to be like quite a windy forest that's like well populated with lots of sort of swaying trees and active you know fauna, lots of critters moving around in there. And our job for me, our job is just to explore it. so that you have more capacity to sort of bring that spirit of exploration into the world out there where it really matters. Like with me, it doesn't matter that much what you do. You could be like, screw you, I'm not taking a breath, and that's fine. We'll find something else for you to do. But out there, it really matters, like how all this stuff functions for you. So I want to give you the most reign, like as much reign as possible for you to move around in your world and learn out there.
Yeah, it's really nice way to describe it. Um,
Oh, it's beautiful work, isn't it? Like we're lucky.
yeah, so lucky. And so you're also, as well as the working with people in a clinical context, you're also doing like research lab work.
Mhm.
Can can you talk a bit about that and where maybe this
Sure.
interbehavioral perspective fits in that world or what you're looking at?
Sure. Yeah, it kind of fits in two ways. I mean, one, it fits in that I also think about, my students' behavior in this sort of unfolding way. It's not a perspective I take off when I move into the classroom or into the lab. So one place that it's relevant is in terms of sort of being able to meet students where they're at and being able to sort of see how different aspects of research or of graduate school sort of limit their repertoire, and starting to build out, how they care for themselves there, or, their sense of connection with their purpose, or, whatever seems to be resourcing for them. So that's one way. We're a non-terminal master's program, so we get a lot of students that like didn't really get it together in undergrad, because here you can go right into doctoral training without a master's, right? So the students that are with us have like additional discernment or additional like disciplining, or they didn't really get a chance to do research because they were working full time. We have a lot of students that have worked all the way through undergrad and are still working all the way through grad school, which is like fairly uncommon here. Um, so I think it becomes sort of relevant in how we approach our lab, my relationships with my students and their relationships with each other. We kind of blew all the rules out the door on like what it means to be in lab and what you have to do to be in lab, and instead decided that our job is just to make it as appetitive as possible, and then people will engage as it fits their world, their field, as it participates in an appetitive way in that. So that's one way. The other way is that, in addition to doing research, collecting data for theses and other kinds of projects, I have some collaborators that are just amazing researchers. They're, you know, collecting a big data set every 5 seconds. It's incredible. Um, but I really like my lab's contribution to that system building that we started off talking about. For me, behaviorism, interbehaviorism, the sort of contextualism to an extent sort of has the great benefit of taking concepts that are of social significance that matter, to the world, to humans, and sometimes to critters other than humans. Um, Taking concepts that really matter and sort of but are hard to act on, and sort of cracking them open and making them actionable. So we wrote a paper right after George Floyd was murdered here in May 2020. We started meeting weekly as a lab, and we just didn't know what to do about it. So we started meeting about it. And gradually those meetings sort of turned into a conversation about privilege and about what privilege is. And we decided, because we're, nerds, we didn't know what to do about it. So we wrote a paper about it. We wrote a conceptual paper unpacking privilege from a behavioral perspective. And what we said is that privilege is a manipulable context. Privilege isn't an aspect of an identity. It's a ratio basically of aversives to appetitives that you have access to, and that it changes from one context to the next. In one context, you might have a ton of privilege and the power and positionality that come with it. In another context, you might have less. What was important to us about this, I'd be happy to share the paper, but what's important to us about this is the idea that when people hear privilege, they don't know what the heck to do about it. They either feel sort of guilty or, sort of justified, or sort of aggravated because they feel like it erases the struggles that they've had, even though they are, insert identity. label here. But for us, we sort of set aside all of that and said, you know, everybody's got a context that are aversive for them. Everybody's got aversive aspects of their history. Everybody's got appetitive stuff. And you have privilege. You have more degrees of freedom to act. You know, more power. You are more empowered when you've got more appetitives than aversives. When they buffer the impact of those aversives. When you can still move around your world with sort of flexibility and freedom. And from that analysis, we were able to issue a bunch of recommendations that were sort of, we called it beyond checking. Like, it's not just about checking your privilege. I'm not even sure what that means, you know, assess it, put it away. I'm not sure, you know, instead, like, how about a sort of systematic consideration of the context in which you tend to present and the extent to which they resource you or don't resource you. We've also done similar papers on affirmative sexual consent. I mean, people hate that idea of yes means yes, because anybody who's sexually active can sort of look at their history and say, like, I don't know, that's not really how it went. It wasn't like yes, 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 yes. You know, there's something that you're perceiving that's like a yes, that's not a yes. How do you know? That's hard for people. It freaks them out. People talk about like having an informed consent before they like bring somebody home from the bar. You know, obviously that's not what is needed. What is needed, we said, is people being able to simultaneously tact appetitive contingencies that are at play or appetitive functional relations at play while manding for specific appetitive functional relations to sort of shift in that direction. And that's what a consent conversation sounds like, an affirmative consent conversation. We also wrote one on vulnerability, functional intimacy. You know, this idea that intimacy across dimensions of power, or vulnerability rather, across dimensions of power and privilege don't necessarily result in intimacy. They only result in intimacy when it's appetitive, when it's consensual, when there's freedom, you know, in that interaction, when it's resourcing to the person to be vulnerable. That's when it facilitates intimacy. Otherwise, it's vulnerability can be oppressive, right? Manding for somebody else to be vulnerable can be a power move. We're currently working on papers on gender and on interfaces between machine and human learning. And these are all sort of deeply informed by an interbehavioral tradition. We don't do the like laying out of the psychological event or the interbehavioral field and then try to sort of parse it. We try to take a little bit more of an accessible sort of stance on those. But for me, my favorite thing that we do is those conceptual papers. And actually, they start with conceptual chats. We have those every lab meeting. Somebody picks a topic and sort of guides us through, you know, what is art? What is grit? What do we mean by attachment behaviorally? You know, what is Riz? We've done vibes. I mean, really anything that is a concept that seems to be relevant in the current zeitgeist or to humanity as a whole. And we unpack it behaviorally, and some of those eventually become papers, and those are probably the things that I'm most proud of is those papers. It's just an incredible to be able to take something that people agree is sort of import for the most part, and to make it accessible and have sort of clear action implications for a person. Yeah, it seems a really cool benefit of behavioral perspective.
So you're taking some of those like socially relevant ideas that either have really multiple meanings or where the meaning is often unclear for people, and then really using like getting really specific and precise about it and exploring, like what does that actually mean?
And what's so cool is, I mean, when you get a lot of practice doing that, Ollie, you don't take offense at people talking any kind of way, right? So somebody can say, I was participating in a sort of spiritual ceremony, and somebody asked me if I would be comfortable with an energy exchange. And what she meant was if she could pay me for my service. You know, I sort of paused and I said, I'm afraid I think I'm okay with it. I'm not exactly, I don't know if she was going to kiss me, right? I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but I don't know. It sounds okay. And she sort of, you know, went on to describe that she wanted to compensate me for my time in service. I don't have to get freaked out about like energy. What does that mean? I mean, I could see very clearly what she was naming, what she was experiencing. The idea that like people say, people speak in a way that is consistent with the context they're in, just like any behavior is consistent with the context you're in. So for me, if we can sort of get really good at translating common language into actionable sort of terms, it always has action implications, but also it makes us able to get along with other people a lot better. So if somebody's naming, I don't know, the vibes are off, like they're not hallucinating. There is a thing that they're experiencing. Also, if they're hallucinating, they are telling me about their experience, and that is useful and functional for our interaction. So being able to yeah, communicate really freely and appreciate people's experiences, from all different kinds of cultural backgrounds or spiritual traditions and belief systems. Like they were naming something, if I was watching a show the other day, and a lady who was quite near her death was given psilocybin mushrooms as part of her kind of cancer treatment, some experimental treatment. And she talked about, she was raised Catholic, and she talked about the Virgin Mary coming to her, and that she learned from Mary that she was all good, actually, that she was going to like be with God. And she was speaking, and you could sort of like really appreciate, I think if you paid attention, and I was raised Catholic, but I don't practice. I wouldn't say that I'm Catholic anymore, um, but I could sort of appreciate the significance of what she was talking about. There were tears in her eyes, her lip trembled. I mean, you could feel the enormity of what it was that she was describing. To me, this kind of ability to translate, I don't know, it's not independent from the clinical work either. It's just being able to appreciate that people speak from the place in which they find themselves, and that we can understand functionally then what anybody means when they say anything. Yeah, so yeah, excited about that work.
Yeah, and I think it's when you're talking about privilege and then talking about that, it's like this, often we don't talk about history, like history is kind of invisibilized in our descriptions of those things. And you think, right, well, someone who's has like the Virgin Mary means something to them, then the history kind of shapes their experience. That's even when they're having psilocybin, which we might assume is just totally, that's just totally independent of any history they have, but it's still kind of showing up. And when I think about privilege, I really think about history that people don't know of like, okay, where I'm sitting here is on, somebody's land that was taken by somebody else at some point, and I am sitting in a house here instead of sitting in Ireland where my family's originally from, because of history, and that history, shows up in the way I'm treated and the opportunities that I have, and that's what I think of as privilege. As it's one part of the fields in those places, but there are other places where I don't have the same privilege because the history is different.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, I love that. Yeah, that kind of, it sounds like you're really, really system building in the lab of taking the observed experiences that haven't been explored from those points of view, and then like, yeah, drawing concepts from there and then exploring them. That's really nice.
It's so cool if it helps us to be able to like just listen to each other and not be scared of terms that aren't, that don't have like fancy psychology sounding ring to them. Because they're able to convey to us where they're at and how things are functioning for them just by behaving. And language can be a super convenient aspect of that, and it can also be really divisive. So if we can sort of, you know, a friend of mine used to ask when people were misbehaving, she would say, "What are you going through?" And it was such a lovely contextual ask. She's not a therapist, just as a friend, she would say, "What are you going through?" You'd be being really grumpy and inappropriate or something, or, drinking too much. I mean, anything that just seemed, problematic, out of character. And her first question was always, what are you going through? You must be in a context. Some part of your forest must be, dark and gloomy today. Help me understand where you're at right now. That's really, really a lovely perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the traditions here where I am has been like there's seasons for burning and fire is how landscape's been regenerated and but very deliberate ways. And yeah, I often think about that as in some way in the work that we're doing, we're kind of putting a fire through that really helps things to regenerate. And if those systems are given the conditions they need, they'll find their right, they'll find their balance and they'll find their right way of being for them that supports that ecosystem. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, well, that to me that feels like a nice way to finish up. So I just
Thank
thank
you
you
so
so much.
much.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time and your contribution. And yeah, if there's those papers sound really interesting, so I'd love to have a look. And if there's a place where your lab's work is kind of where people can go and check that out, check out those publications, let me know and I'll post a link in the notes from the conversation.
Oh, great. Awesome. I will do that. I'll send some papers and also that link. Thanks so much again, Ollie.
Thanks, Em. It was lovely to meet you, and thanks
You
for your
too.
time. Okay, bye.